By the first week of October, before the leaves were fully down, your grandfather was already moving differently through the property. Not faster, just more deliberately. He walked the fence line looking for gaps. He checked the woodpile against what he remembered last winter had taken. He went down into the root cellar with a lantern and stood there for a few minutes just looking at the shelves, counting jars, feeling the temperature of the air around him. He did not make a list. He did not need one. He already knew what winter required, because winter had required the same things every year of his life, and he had been paying attention since he was old enough to carry a piece of firewood without dropping it. In 1955, central heating was not something most American families took for granted. In rural areas, it barely existed. In older houses in cities and towns, it was there but fragile. A coal furnace that needed tending, a boiler that needed watching, pipes that needed keeping warm on the coldest nights. The families who got through winter comfortably were not the ones with the best equipment. They were the ones who knew what to do. They had skills that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to write them down. They were just part of what you knew if you lived in a place where winter was real and preparation was the difference between a hard season and a dangerous one. These are 22 of those skills. Every one of them was ordinary in 1955. Almost none of them are taught today. Skill 1. Reading the sky. Before weather forecasts were reliable, before radar, before satellites, before any of it, your grandfather read the sky the way other people read a newspaper. A ring around the moon meant moisture in the upper atmosphere and precipitation within a day or two. A red sky at morning was not just a saying. It meant high pressure moving east and a weather system coming in behind it. The way animals moved before a storm was consistent and observable. Cattle drifting toward the low side of the pasture, birds flying low and quiet, the dog curling up next to the furnace 3 hours before any human in the house felt the temperature change. He had learned this by watching the sky every morning of his life and then watching what happened next. He was not always right, but he was right often enough that it mattered. Often enough that in October he could look at the sky and the behavior of the horses and tell you within a day or two whether the cold was coming in hard that week or whether you had a little more time. That kind of knowledge does not come from an app. It comes from 40 years of paying attention to the same sky in the same place, and it does not transfer easily to anyone who has not been doing the same. Skill 2. Splitting firewood by reading the grain. A splitting maul is heavier than an axe and wider at the head because it is not meant to cut wood. It is meant to force it apart. The difference matters. You bring the maul down on the end grain of the log, and you aim not at the center, but at the point where the wood wants to give. A natural seam, the edge of a crack that runs up the grain, the spot where the fibers show a tendency to separate. Hit that point, and the wood comes apart cleanly in one swing. Hit anywhere else, and the maul buries itself in the wood and has to be worked out by hand, which is slow and tells you plainly that you were not looking at the log carefully enough before you swung. A man who had been splitting firewood since he was 12 did not think about any of this consciously. His body had the assessment built in, the quick look at the end grain, the placement of the log, the swing, the split, the toss to the pile, the next log. The rhythm was almost peaceful when it was going well. His sons learned by watching, and then by doing, and the doing corrected whatever the watching had not quite conveyed. A cord of seasoned oak or hickory in Ohio cost $10 to $15 delivered in 1955, or nothing if you had your own woodlot and the time to work it. A modest house through a Midwest winter needed 3 to 5 cords. Getting that wrong meant being cold in February, and February did not negotiate. Skill 3. Stacking wood properly so it actually dried. This sounds like it should not require a skill, and that is exactly the kind of thinking that left families burning wet wood in January. Firewood stacked wrong rotted before it dried. Firewood that did not dry burned poorly, produced more smoke than heat, and deposited creosote in the chimney at a rate that eventually meant a chimney fire. Getting it right was not complicated, but it required doing several specific things correctly. The stack went bark side up, so rain ran off instead of soaking in. The bottom row went on top of something: old fence rails, pallets, anything that kept the wood off the ground and let air move underneath. The stack got built with a slight lean inward so it would not topple in the wind, and it went somewhere with good air circulation on all sides, not tight against the house or the barn where the air was still and damp. Wood stacked this way in April was ready to burn by October. Wood stacked wrong was still wet in December, and you were already behind. Your grandfather's woodpile was a structure he took seriously. The rows were even. The ends were locked in place with crossed pieces, so the stack held its shape through rain and freeze and thaw. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it the way he looked at anything he had built, checking it, making sure it would hold. It was going to have to hold until April. That was worth getting right. Skill 4. Banking the fire at night. In a house heated by a wood stove or a coal furnace, one of the last things you did before going to bed was bank the fire, which means you arranged the coals and the remaining fuel in a specific way to keep a low, slow burn going through the night, without the stove going out entirely, and without it burning so hot that it was dangerous to leave unattended. For a wood stove, you pushed the remaining coals together toward the back, added 1 or 2 larger pieces of wood on top, and closed the damper down to restrict the airflow. Less air meant a slower burn, which meant the fire stayed alive through the night without consuming all the fuel by 2 in the morning. For a coal furnace, you shook the grate to drop the ash, added a layer of fresh coal over the remaining live coals, and adjusted the draft to low. In the morning, you opened the damper, shook the grate again, and the fire came back up from what had been kept alive overnight. A family that banked the fire correctly went to bed in a warm house and woke up in a house that was cool but not cold and had a live fire to build back up from. A family that let the fire go out woke up to a house that had been at outside temperature for several hours and a furnace that needed to be relit from scratch, which in a house with small children or elderly people was not just uncomfortable, it was a genuine problem. Banking the fire was the last thing your grandfather did every night of the heating season, and he did it the same way every time, because the same way worked. Skill 5. Weather stripping doors and windows with what you had. A drafty door in January was not a minor inconvenience. It was a source of cold air moving continuously into the house, directly counteracting whatever the furnace was doing, and driving up the fuel bill in a way that added up fast over a full winter. The solution was weather stripping, and in 1955 it was something a homeowner did himself, usually in October before the cold arrived. The most common material was a thin strip of felt or rubber nailed along the door frame where the door made contact. It cost almost nothing at the hardware store and took about an hour to install on a standard exterior door. For windows that let in drafts around the frame, a rope of cork worked into the gap between the window frame and the wall, removed in spring, replaced in fall, sealed the cold out for the season. For the gap at the bottom of an exterior door, a door snake, a fabric tube stuffed with sand or dried beans, laid against the bottom of the door, blocked the cold air from coming in along the floor, where it was worst. Your grandfather checked every exterior door and window in the house in October and fixed whatever was letting cold air in. He did it the same way every year, because the house settled slightly every winter and the gaps shifted. A house that was tight in October stayed manageable through January. A house with drafts worked the furnace twice as hard and still felt cold. Skill 6. Insulating pipes against freezing. A frozen pipe in January was a problem that could go from inconvenient to catastrophic in the time it took for the ice in the pipe to expand enough to split the metal. Your grandfather knew which pipes in his house were vulnerable, the ones that ran along exterior walls, the ones that went through unheated spaces, the ones in the crawl space under the kitchen. He wrapped them in the fall with strips of insulation, Old newspapers worked in a pinch, wrapped tight and held with tape or wire, or covered them with pipe insulation sleeves from the hardware store that cost about a dime a foot. On nights when the temperature was going to drop below 10 degrees, he left the faucets on the vulnerable lines running at a slow drip. Moving water does not freeze as readily as standing water, and a slow drip through the night kept the line from going solid. He also kept the cabinet doors under the kitchen sink open on the coldest nights, so the heat from the house could reach the pipes behind the cabinet wall. These were not complicated measures. They were just things you knew to do if you had ever dealt with a frozen pipe and never wanted to deal with one again. Skill 7. Reading a coal furnace. A coal furnace in 1955 was not a piece of equipment you set and forgot. It was something you managed, multiple times a day, with a specific set of actions that kept it burning efficiently and safely. You shook the grate in the morning to drop the ash into the ash pan below. You checked the ash pan and emptied it every day because a full ash pan restricted the airflow and made the furnace burn cool and dirty. You added coal in layers, not too much at once, because a heavy load smothered the fire, but regularly enough that the temperature stayed consistent. The draft controls, a series of dampers that regulated how much air the furnace drew, needed to be adjusted depending on the outside temperature and the coal being burned. More draft meant more heat, but faster fuel consumption. Less draft meant a slower burn that stretched the coal further, but could let the fire drop too low on very cold nights. A man who ran a coal furnace for 20 winters had the feel of those adjustments in his hands. He knew from the color of the flame and the sound of the draw whether the furnace was running right or needed attention. He knew the difference between the ash of coal that had burned efficiently and the ash of coal that had not. He knew his furnace the way he knew his truck, well enough to hear when something was wrong before it became a problem. Skill 8. Storing root vegetables through winter. Before the modern grocery store made fresh vegetables available year-round regardless of the season, a family that wanted to eat potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets in January had to have stored them correctly in October. The root cellar was where this happened, a cool, dark, slightly damp space, usually underground or built into a hillside, where the temperature stayed consistently between 32 and 40 degrees through the winter without freezing. The vegetables went in after the first light frost had toughened their skins, but before a hard freeze could damage them. They were not washed before storage. Washing removed the protective layer of soil and shortened the storage life significantly. They were packed in boxes of slightly damp sand or sawdust to maintain the moisture level that kept them from drying out and shriveling. Different vegetables stored at slightly different conditions. Potatoes needed darkness and cool temperatures, but not too much moisture. Carrots and parsnips liked more moisture and could go deeper in the sand. Apples went in separately, far from the potatoes, because apples release ethylene gas that makes potatoes sprout. A root cellar managed correctly kept a family in vegetables from October through March without a single trip to the grocery store for produce. The management was not difficult, but it was consistent. You checked the cellar regularly, removed anything that was starting to go soft before it could spread to the vegetables beside it, and adjusted the ventilation to keep the temperature in the right range. Your grandmother knew her root cellar the same way she knew her kitchen. Both of them were tools she used every day. Skill 9. Rendering lard and storing fat. Every fall, when the hog was butchered, one of the first things that happened was the rendering of the lard. The fat was cut from the carcass, cut into small pieces, and cooked slowly in a large pot over low heat until the fat had liquefied and the solid pieces, the cracklings, had given up everything they had. The liquid fat was poured through a cloth into clean crocks or tins and sealed. At room temperature in the cellar, it went solid and stayed good for months. Lard was the cooking fat in most American kitchens through the 1950s, and it was used for everything: frying, baking, making pie crust, seasoning cast iron, waterproofing leather, lubricating machinery in a pinch, and treating minor skin conditions in an emergency. A family that had rendered a full set of crocks in the fall did not worry about running out of cooking fat before spring. A family that had not done it, or had done it poorly, and let the lard go rancid, spent the winter buying lard in cans from the store at a price that was not ruinous, but was also not free. The skill in rendering lard was patience and low heat. Too high a temperature scorched the fat and gave the lard an off flavor that did not go away. Too short a time left water in the fat that caused it to spoil faster in storage. Your grandmother rendered lard the way she did most things in the kitchen, slowly, correctly, without rushing, because the result of rushing was a problem she would be dealing with in February. Skill 10. Making and using a hot water bottle. Before electric blankets, before heated mattress pads, before any of the things that make getting into a cold bed on a January night tolerable, there was the hot water bottle, a rubber bottle filled from the kettle, wrapped in a pillowcase or a flannel sleeve, and placed under the covers at the foot of the bed about 20 minutes before anyone got in. By bedtime, the cold sheets had warmed to something human beings could actually enter without the sharp intake of breath that made the whole operation feel like a punishment. The skill was simple but specific. You filled the bottle with water that was hot but not boiling, too hot, and the rubber cracked over time, and the bottle failed. You held it upright, squeezed out the air before sealing it so it did not pop open under pressure when you placed it under the covers, and you wrapped it before putting it in the bed so it released heat slowly rather than all at once. A well-filled hot water bottle stayed warm enough to be useful for 4 to 6 hours, which was generally long enough to get through the coldest part of the night. Every member of the family had one. Every bed in the house had one in it on the coldest nights. It cost almost nothing to operate, and required nothing except a full kettle and 30 seconds of attention. Skill 11. Treating frostbite correctly. Anyone who spent real time outdoors in a Midwest winter in 1955 knew the early signs of frostbite: the white or grayish patch on a fingertip or earlobe, the waxy feel of skin that had lost its normal texture, the numbness that followed the initial painful cold. And they knew what to do about it, because getting it wrong was considerably worse than getting it right. The correct treatment was slow rewarming. The affected area went into warm, not hot, water, or was warmed against the skin of an unaffected body part, like the armpit or the inner thigh. Rubbing the frostbitten area was exactly wrong. The ice crystals in the tissue could cause damage when moved against each other, but it was the instinctive response, and the families who had been taught otherwise knew to resist the instinct. You warmed it slowly. You did not rub it. You did not put it near a fire or a radiator, where the heat was uneven and too intense for skin that had already been compromised. If the area blistered, you left the blisters alone. This was knowledge that farm families and rural families carried as a matter of course, because frostbite was a genuine winter hazard, and the difference between correct treatment and incorrect treatment was sometimes the difference between keeping the finger and losing it. A man who had worked outside all his life had usually seen both outcomes, and he taught his children which one looked like which and what to do when they saw it. Skill 12. Keeping the water lines moving in an unheated barn. The barn presented a specific winter problem that the house did not. Animals needed water. Water froze. And keeping water available for cattle and horses and hogs through a Midwest winter, without the luxury of a heated barn, required a set of solutions that your grandfather applied every single day, from November through March. Stock tanks got broken every morning. The ice that formed overnight had to be knocked out with a heavy rod or an axe before the animals could drink. Some farmers installed tank heaters, electric elements that floated in the water and kept it just above freezing. But in 1955, electricity to the barn was not universal, and even where it existed, the heater was an expense and a potential failure point. Breaking the tank by hand was free and reliable. It added 15 minutes to the morning chores, and it happened every morning without exception, because animals that could not drink lost condition fast, and condition lost in winter was hard to put back. The pipes that ran water to the barn, where they existed, were wrapped and insulated the same way the house pipes were. On nights below zero, the water to the barn was sometimes shut off at the valve inside the house, and the line drained, because a frozen outdoor line that burst was a repair job in February, which was not when anyone wanted to be lying under a barn with tools in the mud and cold. Skill 13. Salting and sanding an icy path. Ice on the path between the house and the barn was not just an inconvenience in 1955, it was a hazard that could put a farmer down with a broken hip or wrist, alone in the early morning, before anyone else in the house was awake. The management of ice was taken seriously by people who understood what a fall in those circumstances actually meant. Rock salt was the primary tool. Spread over ice before a freeze hardened it fully, or over existing ice to begin the melting process, it worked reliably down to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, it lost effectiveness, and sand took over. Not because sand melted ice, but because it provided traction over ice that was not going to melt, regardless of what you put on it. Your grandfather kept both in covered bins near the back door, always full, always ready, because you did not want to be looking for them at 5:30 in the morning with the temperature below zero. The path from the house to the barn was cleared and sanded before anything else on an icy morning. The path to the outhouse, where one still existed, was next. Then the driveway, if the vehicle needed to move. The priority order was not random. It reflected what mattered most, and what could cost the most if it went wrong. Skill 14. Preserving meat through the cold season. Before freezers were common in American homes, and in 1955 the standalone chest freezer was only beginning to appear in rural households. A family that butchered a hog or a steer in November needed to preserve that meat through the winter without it spoiling. The cold was part of the solution, but cold alone was not enough. The skills were curing and smoking, and both required specific knowledge to do correctly. Salt curing, packing the meat in dry salt or submerging it in a salt brine, drew moisture out of the meat and created an environment where bacteria could not survive. A pork shoulder cured in salt for 3 to 4 weeks, then hung in the smokehouse over a smouldering hickory fire for several more weeks, became a ham that would keep for months at cellar temperature without refrigeration. The smoking added flavor, but also deposited compounds on the surface of the meat that further inhibited bacterial growth. A smokehouse managed correctly produced meat that was safe and delicious and required nothing but time and attention. Your grandfather knew which woods to use for smoking, hickory and apple and cherry for flavor, never pine or any resinous softwood that would make the meat taste like turpentine. He knew how long the fire needed to burn and how hot it needed to be, and how to read the smoke coming out of the smokehouse vent to know whether the temperature inside was right. He had done it every November of his adult life. The hams hanging in the cellar through the winter were the product of that knowledge, and they tasted like it. Skill 15. Making tallow candles for emergency light. When the power went out in a winter storm in 1955, and in rural areas it went out regularly, sometimes for days, you did not call the power company and wait in the dark. You lit candles. And the candles that your grandmother made in the fall from the rendered tallow of the fall butchering were free, long-burning, and available in whatever quantity she had decided to make. Tallow candles were made by repeatedly dipping a cotton wick into liquid tallow and letting each layer cool and harden before the next dip. A proper candle required 20 to 30 dips to reach a useful diameter. The work was done in a cool room, so the layers cooled quickly between dips. The finished candles went into a box in the cellar, where they stayed cool and solid until needed. They burned more slowly than paraffin candles, and with a slightly different quality of light, warmer and softer and more variable, but they were made from material that was already in the house and cost nothing additional. A family with a box of homemade tallow candles in the cellar could get through a week-long power outage in relative comfort. A family without them was dependent on store-bought candles that they might or might not have remembered to keep on hand. Your grandmother kept a box. She made sure of it every fall, before she needed them, because you did not want to be discovering that you were out of candles at 9 o'clock on a January night when the power had been out since 4. Skill 16. Managing a root cellar's temperature. The root cellar did not manage itself. It needed attention through the winter, not daily, but regularly, and with an understanding of what the vegetables inside needed to survive from October to March in good condition. Too cold, and the vegetables froze. Too warm, and they rotted. Too dry, and they shriveled. Too wet, and they molded. The range that kept everything alive and useful was narrow, and it shifted as the outside temperature shifted. Your grandmother managed the cellar temperature by controlling the ventilation. On mild days in late fall and early spring, she opened the ventilation duct slightly to let cool outside air in. On very cold nights, she closed it fully to prevent the inside temperature from dropping below freezing. She checked the temperature with a thermometer hung near the most vulnerable vegetables, the potatoes, which were damaged by freezing before most of the other crops, and she adjusted accordingly. She also managed the humidity by keeping a pan of water in the cellar on dry winter days, and by making sure the drainage in the floor was clear, so excess moisture did not pool. The vegetables were checked every week or two, and anything that was beginning to soften or show mold came out immediately and went into the kitchen to be used that day. One bad potato left in a box of good ones could ruin the entire box within a week. She knew this. She checked. She removed. The cellar stayed productive until the new vegetables came in the following spring. Skill 17. Caulking and sealing the house in fall. Every fall, before the cold arrived, your grandfather walked the perimeter of the house with a bucket of caulk and a putty knife and filled every gap he could find. Around the window frames where they met the siding. Around the foundation sill, where the wood frame of the house sat on the concrete or stone foundation. Around the pipes and wires where they entered the house from outside. Around the chimney, where it passed through the roof. Every gap in the envelope of the house was a place where cold air entered and warm air left, and over a winter those gaps added up to a significant loss of heat and a significant addition to the fuel bill. The caulk he used in 1955 was not the silicone caulk that comes in a gun today. It was an oil-based caulk, applied with a putty knife or a caulking gun, that hardened in place and stayed flexible through winter. It lasted about 5 years before it dried out and cracked and needed replacing. Your grandfather replaced it on a cycle, a different section of the house each fall, so that the whole house was recaulked over a 5-year rotation and nothing went too long without attention. It was a maintenance rhythm, not a crisis response. The house that was recaulked on schedule stayed tight. The house that was recaulked when someone noticed the cold air coming in was always behind. Skill 18. Knowing when to call for help and when not to. This is not a technical skill, but it was a real one, and the families that had it got through winters that the families without it did not. The judgment of when a problem exceeded your own capacity to handle it and required outside help, a doctor, a veterinarian, a neighbor with equipment you did not have, was something that took years to develop and that could not be learned from a book. Your grandfather knew which animal symptoms indicated something he could treat himself and which ones needed the veterinarian in town, 15 miles away, on roads that might not be passable by morning. He knew which mechanical problems with the furnace or the truck he could fix with what was in the shop and which ones would get worse if he touched them. He knew when a family member's illness was something that rest and home treatment would resolve, and when it was something that needed to get to a doctor, regardless of what the roads looked like. The bias was toward handling things yourself, because the cost and difficulty of getting outside help in a rural winter in 1955 was real. But the judgment of when that bias needed to be overridden, when the problem was genuinely beyond your capacity, and the cost of delay was worse than the cost of getting help, was what separated the families that came through hard winters well from the ones that did not. Skill 19. Keeping a sick animal alive through winter. A cow that went off feed in February, or a horse that showed signs of colic in the middle of a January night, was a problem that your grandfather addressed immediately and with whatever knowledge he had, because losing a work animal or a milk cow in midwinter was a serious financial blow on top of a practical emergency. He knew the basic treatments for the most common livestock ailments because he had dealt with them before and because his father had taught him what to do. Colic in a horse, a catch-all term for abdominal pain that could range from mild gas colic to a life-threatening intestinal obstruction, required walking the horse to prevent it from rolling and injuring itself, monitoring its vital signs, and deciding within a few hours whether it was resolving on its own or getting worse. A horse that was getting worse needed the veterinarian. A horse that was responding to being walked and given small amounts of water was probably going to be all right. The judgment between those two situations required knowing what a horse in normal health looked and sounded and felt like, so that the departure from normal was recognizable and readable. Your grandfather had that knowledge because he had spent his entire life around horses. The same knowledge, applied to cattle and hogs, came from the same source. There was no substitute for it, and there was no quick way to acquire it. It was built from years of daily contact with animals, years of noticing what normal looked like, so that abnormal was immediately apparent. Skill 20. Making a snow break for the driveway. Snow fences, low wooden or wire fences erected at right angles to the prevailing winter wind, were a feature of farm properties across the Midwest and the Northern Plains, and the farmers who put them up correctly had significantly less work to do keeping their driveways and farmyards clear through the winter than the ones who did not. The principle was simple. Snow carried by wind behaves like water. It follows the path of least resistance and deposits where the wind slows down. A snow fence created a zone of reduced wind speed on its downwind side, and the snow dropped into that zone rather than continuing onto the driveway or into the farmyard. A well-positioned snow fence could keep a driveway essentially clear through storms that required hours of shoveling on unprotected properties. Your grandfather put his snow fences up in October before the first significant snow and took them down in April. The positioning required knowing the direction of the prevailing winter wind on his specific property, which was not always obvious, because terrain and buildings deflected the wind in ways that only showed up in the pattern of drifts over several winters of observation. He had made notes over the years of where the drifts formed and what that told him about the wind. The fences went where the notes said they should go, and they worked because the notes were accurate. Skill 21. Drying and storing herbs for winter medicine. The herbs your grandmother grew through the summer, the chamomile, the yarrow, the elderberry, the mint, had to be harvested and dried and stored before the first frost if they were going to be available through the winter when they were most needed. A family that caught cold and fever in January was not going to the garden for fresh herbs. It was going to the shelf in the kitchen where the dried herbs from last summer were stored in glass jars with tight lids. The harvesting happened at the right moment for each plant. Chamomile flowers were picked when they had just fully opened, in the morning after the dew had dried, but before the afternoon heat had driven off too much of the essential oil. Yarrow was cut in full flower. Mint was harvested just before it bloomed, when the oil content in the leaves was highest. Each plant was tied in small bundles and hung upside down in a warm, dry, well-ventilated space, usually the pantry or a dry room near the kitchen, and left for 2 to 3 weeks until the material was fully dry and crumbled easily between the fingers. Dried herbs stored in glass jars kept their potency for about a year, which was exactly how long they needed to last, from one summer's harvest to the next. Your grandmother's herb shelf in winter was the medicine cabinet for minor illnesses, and she knew what each jar contained and what it was for and how to prepare it. That knowledge, combined with the herbs themselves, meant that a winter cold, or a headache, or an upset stomach, had an answer that did not require a trip to town in bad weather. Skill 22. Teaching the children. This was the last skill and the most important one, and it was the one that is most completely gone. Every skill on this list existed because someone had taken the time to teach it to the person who used it. Your grandfather knew how to read the sky because his father had pointed out the ring around the moon on a November evening when he was 8 years old and explained what it meant, and then showed him what happened the next day. Your grandmother knew how to bank the fire and manage the root cellar and dry the herbs because her mother had done those things in front of her for years and had eventually handed them over, not in a formal lesson, just in the natural process of working alongside someone who knew what they were doing. The teaching happened in the work. You split wood next to someone who split wood correctly, and the correction came in real time, not from a book, not from a class, but from someone standing next to you saying, "Look at the grain before you swing." You stood next to the furnace while your father shook the grate and learned what the right sound was and what the wrong sound was. You watched your mother check the root cellar, and you learned what she was looking for without necessarily being told in words, because words were often not how this knowledge moved. That transmission chain broke in the 1960s and 1970s as central heating became universal, and the freezer replaced the root cellar, and the supermarket made the garden optional, and the furnace maintenance contract replaced the man who knew his own furnace. The skills did not disappear because anyone decided they were worthless. They disappeared because the situations that required them disappeared first, and the knowledge followed with no one noticing, and by the time anyone thought to look for it, the people who had held it were gone. Your grandfather knew 22 things that nobody is teaching anymore. He knew them the way he knew the sound of his own floorboards, so completely and so automatically that he never once thought of them as skills. They were just what you did to get through winter. They were just Tuesday in November, and Wednesday, and every day after that, until the ground thawed in April, and the whole cycle started over from the beginning. Memory Lane, America. One story at a time.